Hello, I'm Anthony. Today we're going to have a chat about strumming the electric guitar with a plectrum. Two very specific use cases for a much wider discussion. I very often strum with my fingers. I very often play an acoustic guitar. We're not interested in those things today. We're just going to figure out or talk about using one of these because it's actually a surprisingly technical and difficult thing to do. And just like when you're learning to drive a car, everything about that process is incredibly challenging because you're having to concentrate on the technical specifics. Eventually, the entire thing becomes subconscious and you're able to drive without thinking. The problem is when you're learning all of those technical processes, if you learn any of them badly, you're going to carry over those bad processes for the rest of your life and you're going to drive badly. It's exactly the same with strumming. And in recent months, I've been basically picking apart my technique, trying to figure out how do I strum, because it's not really something I've ever really thought about. And I asked myself two separate questions. One, is there anything I'm doing wrong or that can be improved? And two, is there anything that I do that I don't hear other people talking about? And the answer to both of those questions was yes, and that's what we're going to have a look at today. We're also going to do it in a very musical context because I really hate dry technical exercises. I don't do scales or any of that nonsense. If I'm going to practice a technical process like strumming, I want to do it in a really musical way. And so I've chosen a riff that we're going to concentrate on today that basically allows you to concentrate entirely on your right hand, entirely on this thing, and more or less completely ignore your left hand because what it's doing is so simple. Now, each time I get into any heavy-duty riffing today, I'm going to have to mute the mic because you're going to hear all of this horrible plectrum noise and it'll be a bit offensive. But just for now, I'm going to leave the mic on while we talk about the riff. So here's the pattern. We're going to play open, E, B, E. So 6, 2, 1 are going to be open all the time and we're strumming all 6 strings all of the time. Strings 5, 4, 3, however, are going to be fretted all the time using two different patterns. The E major shape and the A major shape, but we're just fretting 5, 4, 3. So for instance, if I play a D chord, it would look like this. So I'm fretting 5, 7, 7, but strumming all 6 strings. Between those two patterns, you can create some really, really musical stuff. I'll give you a demo now, mute the mic, and then we'll come back and we'll figure out exactly what's going on with this right hand. Lots and lots of different variations of that riff. We can come up to 10, 12, but primarily we're playing on 7, 5, 3, a cheeky little F sharp over E with an added B, added 11. The beauty of this is that the left hand is doing something so simple that you can do it almost unconsciously. Flipping between those two chords feels really natural, so you can basically just forget that hand. You're not having to bar anything, so your hand's not getting fatigued. And you can really lace into it and play it for minutes on end without getting bored. So now let's concentrate on the matter at hand. What are we doing with the plectrum? First things first, what plectrum am I using? Well, at the moment, I'm quite a big fan of the Gator plectrums. I don't know how to get that in focus. This is a 0.71 and Dunlop Gator. I used to use Dunlop Tortex for years and discovered that basically randomly bought all of the Dunlops. You can buy on eBay one of every type of plectrum. It turns out, I don't know if you can see that, the Gator is very slightly smaller than the Tortex. Can you see a halo? I hold it against my jumper. See a halo of green around the Gator. That turns out to make a really big difference. These days when I hold a standard Tortex plectrum in my hand, it just feels so clunky, so big and unwieldy. Just trimming off that little bit of size really makes a big difference. You want this thing to be as comfortable as you possibly can, so try lots of different plectrum types. This is going to be very much a subjective thing, and in fact, that's going to be the last time, as much as I can possibly try in this video, to talk about subjectivity, because a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today is subjective, and I don't want to bore you by saying the same thing over and over again. These are my plectrums of choice. If I'm strumming, I use a 71. If I'm playing a solo, I'll use the Gator 96, and those are my two favourite plectrums. As far as the thickness of plectrum is concerned, people say that, and it's true, that the softer the plectrum that you use, the easier it is to strum, because the plectrum actually gives you a little bit of like leeway so that you don't snag the plectrum on the strings. That's true, and if you're absolutely at the very beginning of your guitar journey, then sure, try something like a 0.5. I have a 0.5 here actually, so this is a Dunlop 0.5, and it is very, very floppy. It strums perfectly well, and it's a very nice plectrum to use. It doesn't take you long before you can graduate up to something that's a little bit more hefty. So anyway, this is my pick of choice, and the reason I've started there is because it's fundamentally important to your sound, your plectrum choice. Different picks create different tones, so it's really worthwhile trying out different types. Now let's talk about physical position. I've got the guitar, I'm actually suspended, even though I'm sat down. I'm using a strap, and it's entirely suspended off my body, so it's as if I'm stood up. The neck's nice and high, and in a position that when I strum, I'm basically going from the neck pickup down to the middle pickup. I'm kind of drawing a diagonal between those two pickups. This diagonal motion on the strings is really important. If you try to play too perpendicular, the plectrum's going to get caught on the strings, and it's going to be much more difficult to play. But to be absolutely honest with you, it's kind of difficult to physically play really perpendicular anyway. I find that I naturally, if I'm kind of rotating, I'm doing that motion anyway, but nevertheless, we're talking about technical processes. So have a think about the angle that your plectrum makes against the strings in a perpendicular. It's kind of 20 degrees, I would say, off perpendicular. Before we get into the really nitty-gritty specifics of actual plec on strings, however, just a bit more kind of meta discussion. Tone, don't have something too deep. If you're strumming strings, you're sending a lot of power into those strings and therefore into the pickups. Bass is basically louder than treble all the time. So if I put the pickup switch on the bass selector, which is actually my soloing pickup of choice, all of that beefy mush just ends up becoming overwhelming, so I take a little bit of it off. On this particular guitar, I prefer the middle pickup when I'm strumming. Again, going to be a totally salt to choice thing, damn I said it. But anyway, it's something to bear in mind. Take off some bass when you're strumming. Certainly when it comes to recording music, you're going to be really thankful that you did that, because the guitar's not just going to be an absolute mass of bass frequencies. Finally, as far as environmental considerations are concerned, where's your arm? Well, my arm is sat on this beautiful curve of the most perfect guitar design of all time, because we have this lovely shelf for my arm to sit on. Now, when I'm strumming, I tend to do the majority of my strumming from the wrist. You'll see a lot of guitarists online tell you that this is a bad thing, that the majority of your strumming should come from the arm. Well, personally, the vast majority of the motion comes from my wrist. And when we get into the technical processes of it, you'll see how I use that to my advantage. But in terms of comfort, it's completely relaxed. If you're going to go into a big strumming session, just exhale and kind of just let all of your muscles really flop so that this arm is completely loose and relaxed. Now for the most contentious part of plectrum strumming, your hand position. So I need to play a chord to get this completely natural in my hand. Yep, that'll do. Right, so kind of taking a snapshot of exactly where my hand is when I strummed that chord. I'll try to rotate it in every possible angle I can think of to do, and everything's back to front, so it's really difficult. You can see that my finger, now I have long fingernails because the majority of the time when I'm playing the guitar I play with my fingers, so I have a long fingernail on my forefinger, and it's fairly close to the tip of the plectrum, but it's sufficiently far away. Stop going up, down here. It's sufficiently far away for it never to get in the way. When I'm strumming, I'm in absolutely no danger at all of that fingernail touching the strings, but I do want it pretty close. If you come up too high, there's just far too much tension. All of this wiggle is going to make it really difficult for you to keep hold of the plectrum. find my natural position again. There we are. Thumb completely perpendicular. There we go. That's so hard to demonstrate in a camera back to front. But there you go. Thumb literally perpendicular on the plectrum and actually poking out quite a long way. See how far away that is? That allows me to hook my thumb very slightly. And when I'm playing the plectrum, now I'm looking kind of down on the strings, sort of a 10-degree angle. So it's not completely flat to the strings. I've just bent the thumb knuckle really, really subtly. It's not a heavy bend at all. I see some people play with very heavily crooked, bent thumbs. That's not me. There's a little bend there. So in addition to me going diagonally across the strings, I'm also rotating the plectrum clockwise around 10 degrees. You add those two things together and I'm kind of stroking across the strings much more easily, and they all ring very pleasantly without the plectrum being in danger of getting caught in them. But there's one more angle to talk about as well, and I very rarely come across anybody discussing this. That's how angled the plectrum is with respect to the strings. So now I'm talking about, I want to come kind of down onto the strings, but then I push my hand away from me so that the plectrum glides across the strings. So I've generated 3 different angles there, and they're all quite subtle, but they all combine for a really dramatic effect. If I start off absolutely flat, dead straight to the strings, I'm going to angle so that I'm going diagonally across them. I'm going to bend my thumb slightly so that the plectrum is rotated clockwise as it glides diagonally across the strings. And I'm also rotating my wrist very slightly so that the plectrum is dragging across the strings as it goes. All 3 of those together are all really subtle but really important. Now here's the idiosyncrasy of mine that I don't hear talked about very much. When I come back up, my wrist rotates so that now I'm dragging the plectrum in the opposite direction, and it runs really smoothly over the strings in that direction. What I'm going to do now is mute the mic and try as unprejudicedly as possible to play perpendicular. We'll see how that sounds, and then I'll switch to a much more wristy method where in each direction my wrist is completely unconsciously but very deliberately stroking in both directions. Let's have a go at that. Now it'll be interesting in editing to see how different those two were. They felt like chalk and cheese to play. The first one I was trying as hard as possible to make it work. I didn't want to deliberately fluff it because it's not the technique that I use, but it was just like wading through mud, really challenging to make all of those chords sound properly. The moment I had that rotation into my wrist, suddenly want to start singing Yesterday. But that's the kind of, that really rolling, gentle motion just makes everything much, much easier for me to play. Next thing to discuss, how am I maintaining a grip on the plectrum? Now, my hands are naturally very dry. They don't tend to sweat very much. And I have very great difficulty with the plectrum rotating in my hand because it doesn't stay where I want it to. Now, very often when you're not strumming all of the time, you have momentary pauses, and they're the perfect opportunity for you to make tiny little adjustments. You generally use your middle finger to kind of move the plectrum back into place so that it's ready to go again. That's all very well and good, but in this particular exercise, and one of the reasons I've chosen it, is because it's absolutely relentless. It's basically strumming all of the time, and so you don't get an opportunity to make those little micro adjustments because you're strumming all of the time. My secret weapon in those occasions is my middle finger, because when I'm strumming more rapidly, I actually find out that my hand naturally closes. When it does, my middle finger rests on the edge of the plectrum, and anchors it. So now I can play pretty freely and pretty aggressively. I'm hitting the strings quite hard here, you know, it's quite an active thing. And as I am, without that middle finger anchor, the plectrum would be in danger of rotating. But simply by bringing my finger up and resting it on the side of the plectrum, it's completely locked in place, and now it's absolutely not going anywhere. Now, when I start playing more slowly or with greater precision, I find that my hand naturally opens up. And part of the reason for this, I've discovered, is that my little finger likes to anchor on the guitars. If you actually look at the length of my fingernails, the 3 primary fingernails are all quite long. Not massive, but they're quite long. And the little finger is very short. That allows me to anchor on the guitar without tapping it with the fingernail. So if I'm doing something more like, see how my hand kind of naturally opens up and just rests on the fingerboard. Whereas the moment I want to start strumming, firstly, I kind of need the anchor of my middle finger, so that's going to naturally loop around and do its job. That inherently pulls the other fingers in. But more importantly, I find it much easier to rotate my hand like that. I'm literally just kind of shaking my hand backwards and forwards, rotating the wrist. My arm's actually doing very little when I strum. If I really get into the power chordy sort of stuff, yes, it's coming more from the arm. But generally speaking, and particularly for this exercise, it's much more from the wrist. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. I'll see you again. Thanks very much.